Yeah, I think that's a good segue. I'll go ahead and get started. My name's Janusz. I'm doing a talk today on why L2s need to pay Bitcoin miners money. My argument is that L2s, specifically to like sidechains and rollups, one of our researchers, Veronica, gave a talk yesterday on like ARC and touched on Lightning and shielded CSV. So I'm going to focus on sidechains and rollups today. I'm going to argue that these are actually sovereign, like layer one type blockchain systems, and their relationship as an L2 with Bitcoin only is that of Bitcoin, the asset, and they need to make sure that that asset always retains value. So paying to the, contributing to the security budget is part of that. There are no outcomes in this talk. I'm gonna make a bunch of claims and make a bunch of arguments, but I'm not actually, and I'm gonna yell at everybody, but I'm not actually gonna suggest to do anything different. Well, I am suggesting one thing, but it's not like there's any direct outcome, so I'm sorry that you're just gonna hear me ramble for 25 minutes. My name's Janusz. I work on the Bitcoin Layers project. I used to work on Zcash and Espresso. Espresso is like a shared sequencer protocol in Ethereum. I want Zcash on Bitcoin, and the reason I want Zcash on Bitcoin is because I think that Zcash privacy is really cool, but I'm also very interested in things like fair launch, proof of work, and capped issuance, which Zcash didn't have a fair launch. It's shifting to proof of stake, and we don't know if Zcash will be able to have capped issuance due to not being able to sustain its own fee environment. So I am now looking at how we can maybe do Zcash-style second layers on Bitcoin. So from ChatGPT, the Bitcoin security budget refers to the total amount of financial resources dedicated to maintaining the security and the integrity of the Bitcoin network. And we want to make sure that the Bitcoin network has the security and integrity so we can always have a valuable Bitcoin asset. And what I'm using for a layer 2 definition today is a layer 2 is a protocol that takes transaction execution off chain and enables any user to ensure the integrity of a two-way peg. What I mean by that is by a two-way peg, you have some multi-sig where all the Bitcoin is stored, and if someone tried to be malicious and steal that money, any Bitcoin full node or any user could be able to submit a challenge transaction to stop them from stealing the money. When we think about layer 2s, bridges aren't actually real. This is the Brooklyn Bridge, and that's a real bridge, but blockchain bridges aren't real. They don't exist. What we actually are doing is we're having a two-way peg where we use L1 assets on a smart contract on the L1 chain to mint and burn tokens that are L2 tokens on another system, like, for example, wrap Bitcoin on Ethereum. If this peg is broken and L2 assets, if this peg is broken and all the money is removed from this L1 smart contract, the L2 tokens still exist. So there's still WBTC if the money backing it is completely gone. That token still exists on the sidechain. And L2s, in some scenarios, because they're sovereign systems, might want to hard fork and break the official two-way peg. So for example, you have a roll-up smart contract or a roll-up style bridge. You might want to break away from that bridge and devalue Bitcoin assets on your chain if your native token, for example, has a much higher market cap, it is more valuable. And that layer 2 token, let's say there's a smart contract hack and 80% of the supply goes to a malicious actor. You can have scenarios where an L2 or sidechain type system would want to hard fork, break away from the two-way peg, and start a new chain to revert the state to give everybody access back to the L2 asset because it's more valuable than the L1 asset. So my argument with this point here is that L2s are only L2s in relationship with the specific asset that you hold on the chain. If you're holding an L2 asset and that's the only one you interact with, you're actually interacting with a system more similar to a layer 1 blockchain. The reason we need to have these L2 systems sustain the fee environment is because we have really small blocks in Bitcoin, and issuance halves every 4 years. So we have small blocks, so we need L2s and to take transaction execution off chain because it won't scale. Issuance halves every 4 years. It's going to eventually stop, so there's not going to be newly issued coins to miners to incentivize them to secure the network. So we need fees to make up the difference. And my thesis is that if we need L2s because of the small blocks and we need a lot of fees, we need to have L2s put a lot of stuff on chain to incentivize miners and also sustain the security budget. Additionally, I don't think the term of settlement layer is an actually good way to look at Bitcoin. And a good way to look at how we're defining L2s. The finality of the L1 asset is always enforced by the two-way peg mechanism. So that's why we're trying to build things like BitVM, BitVMX, BitVM2, etc. because we want to have a validating bridge that enforces the validity of all withdrawals and ensure those withdrawals are going to the correct users when they leave the system. Bitcoin cannot enforce L2 finality based on the data there. This is true of roll-up sequencer batches. This is true of state roots that maybe a sidechain will post on and anchor to the Bitcoin chain. Bitcoin, this is arbitrary data, and Bitcoin itself is not enforcing any finality or reorg resistance. It's the L2 consensus mechanism that forces that. So it's the L2 consensus mechanism pointing to a specific point on the chain and then building upon that. So I just want to really say quickly that when we're thinking about L2s, we're not looking at it as them inheriting kind of network security from Bitcoin. We're only inheriting security with regards to the Bitcoin asset. So when we look at some of the L2s, this is Lightning McQueen. I don't know if you guys have seen Cars. But this is the Lightning Network. We'll just touch on this. Transaction execution off-chain. To it, you can ensure the integrity of a two-way peg or your payment channel if your counterparty becomes malicious. And your fees paid to the network are to open and close channels. We're not entirely sure if this is like the most fee revenue intensive mechanism to sustain the security budget long term. So we have these different types of solutions. So we have roll-ups. They have transaction execution on chain. They can have two-way pegs where the integrity of the chain, the integrity of the peg is done on chain. They can also have federations, like a roll-up can have a federated two-way peg, just like a sidechain can. And the fees that are paid to the miners are fees to post all of the transaction data in a sequencer batch and also a validity proof or a fraud proof on chain. Validiums. This is birds aren't real. I don't know if you guys have seen that. But birds aren't real, validiums aren't real. I don't think they're real. Some people do. But for the sake of the conversation, we'll describe them. They do transaction execution off-chain. You can ensure the integrity of a two-way peg on-chain, but the data availability system, because the data is being posted onto another system, can withhold the data, so you can't process withdrawals. And then the proofs containing the latest state root and proof of execution are posted on chain. If you do something like Groth 16, that's maybe 200 bytes, every 8 hours or so would be kind of what you would be posting on chain in this mechanism. And then we have sidechains. You also have transaction execution off chain. You have the two-way peg integrity can be enforced on chain in some mechanisms. I think BitVMX is going to be the first time that someone in a sidechain style system is trying to do this. You can earn fees in a sidechain via merge mining. I would say that's probably the most straightforward way. And then additionally, you can do things like Stacks does and post a state root on chain every periodically as well. So when we look at these systems, though, I think we're conflating all of these things and trying to say that they're different. Rollups are sidechains. They're blockchains with their own full node software. They can hard fork. They can make decisions as a social system. They can hard fork away from the L1 that they use for DA. Validiums additionally are sidechains because they're rollups to other blockchains that have a kind of official enshrined two-way peg with Bitcoin. And sidechains are sidechains. The reason we say that rollups can potentially be L2s, maybe if we even tighten that definition to say it's a unilateral exit definition for L2, is because if there's a soft fork on Bitcoin and you can actually verify the state transition in script directly, then a user might be able to bypass a bridge operator set to withdraw their funds from a bridge contract. But in all systems today, with BitVM, et cetera, none of these systems I would say are L2s in that definition, but they are L2s in the sense that anybody can ensure the integrity of a two-way peg if they have the correct type of bridge mechanism in place. So what is Bitcoin and its relationship with L2s? Like we mentioned earlier, it's not the settlement layer. So what is the actual relationship with Bitcoin? It's a decentralized network that we have all socially agreed to value and socially agreed to opt into with a pristine asset due to the economics behind the asset. We want to use this asset on other networks for monetary purposes because we value the asset, and we cannot transact with this asset directly on the Bitcoin L1. Again, it doesn't enforce L2 finality, but it can enforce the validity of withdrawals from bridge programs if the bridge program is constructed correctly. So when we look at Bitcoin and its relationship as a main chain with L2s, the L2 relationship is always dependent on the bridge program that you have in place, and if the Bitcoin consensus participants have the ability to enforce the validity of withdrawals. So let's talk about something that is related to the security of two-way pegs in some scenarios, data availability. So data availability is essentially, for a side system, is making the data available to some set of consensus participants for some certain amount of time. Typically, in some systems, this is the amount of time that you would need to construct a fraud proof. So maybe data availability is made available every 2 weeks. So anybody, if they need to construct a fraud proof before the challenge period times out, they have the data and are able to do that. Data availability on Bitcoin is very scarce. We only have, like we mentioned, 4 megabytes of data available every 10 minutes. And if we have rollups and validiums and sidechains and all these different types of systems trying to throw proofs and throw sequencer batches on chain, that becomes very, very competitive and very expensive. So if you look at Ethereum with the Ethereum blobs, which was recently implemented, I think, this year, that's 9 times. Has 9 times more throughput, and then Celestia currently has 23 times more throughput, and Celestia is even trying to go to like 1 gigabyte blocks. And they're making a trade-off with that to implement another mechanism where they have more secure light clients, but they're trying to even make the blocks even bigger, which would make more data available and make it cheaper to post sequencer data or proofs on chain. So when we look at like rollups specifically, and like we mentioned earlier, rollups can be quite secure, but it comes at a cost. So if we're posting 400 kilobytes on chain, every 6 blocks is what this chart is showing. That can be very, very expensive. And like at a 10 sat per vbyte environment, that's like 450,000, and 50 sat per vbyte can go up to 2.3 million. And these costs are always taken back down to the user. So if you only have 50,000 transactions a month, because this chart below is based on the 400 kilobytes, the user for even in a low fee environment is going to be paying $10 per transaction, and then if there's more transactions, obviously those costs are distributed across the user set. But there are ways to optimize this. There are ways to, if you use certain data compression techniques, you don't have to post like the full sequencer batch. You can just post the differentials in state, which would make this a little bit cheaper, but still long term, this is going to be a very, very costly thing. So why would you want to do that? Because if you post the data to Bitcoin directly, you do maintain the highest level of security for users of Bitcoin assets. It does provide that consistent fee revenue for miners. You have minimal trust assumptions outside of your Bitcoin full node. With regards to like being able to verify the data and reconstruct the state of the system. And in these systems, a lot of the times, there's no reliance on another token or inflationary economic models, because if the data is on Bitcoin and you enable the user to bypass a sequencer or bypass a validator set, which you need to make the data on Bitcoin to make them available, make them able to do that, you don't need to actually build a decentralized consensus set and incentivize them with another token, because the users can unilaterally exit to the or force include their transactions to the L1 miner set. And if the sequencer doesn't include that transaction in the next block, they'd be slashed. So we have the ability to put a lot of pressure on the sequencer to make sure that it doesn't censor in this model. But that very theoretical world where we can have a single validator and not have to build a distributed consensus set only works in some scenarios. So if we look here, if the rollup doesn't have forced inclusion and doesn't have the ability to self-propose your own state transition and has a centralized rollup operator, your trust assumption is completely dependent on the single rollup operator, the one node. And if you can't bypass that, your liveness and the ability to get your money out is dependent on one entity. If you do have forced inclusion and have no self-proposing, and you have a centralized rollup operator, you're still dependent on the rollup operator, and that can be better than a sidechain in some scenarios, but only if the rollup has to post a bond, and if they don't force include transactions in the subsequent block, they get slashed. So if they don't have that in place, then it's not better in the sidechain. If they do have that in place, well, you can make an argument that it is. And then if you have forced inclusion, self-proposing, and then a centralized operator, we could argue that it's better than a traditional sidechain in sense of a sidechain with no data availability on Bitcoin. But then if you get to no centralized operators, you have, if you have self-proposing and forced inclusion, we would say that's better. But if you don't have forced inclusion and you don't have self-proposing, but you have a decentralized sequencer set, it's the same exact thing as a sidechain in the regards of a trust assumption related to getting your assets out of the side system. So the data availability is important, and having that data on chain is important only if it enables a user to self-propose their own state transition. And if they're not able to do that, then it's kind of a moot point. And we should also clarify that there's no in-production rollups on Bitcoin today. And in Ethereum, I think 1 out of 70 rollups has forced inclusion and self-proposing enabled. I think there's about 10 that have, there's 2 rollups that enable this. And I think there's maybe 10 to 12 that enable forced inclusion. We do really key point that in the sidechain family, within maybe rootstock or liquid or some other mechanism, unavailable blocks can be orphaned. So if there's a data withholding attack, it's kind of ineffective because they're incentivized to post their blocks on chain, so they can get block rewards. This is a bit different than a Validium model, because the Validium model, if the value of the money locked in the bridge contract is greater than that of the money that these validators can make from block rewards, and they're incentivized to freeze the data and try to steal the money and collude with the sequencer. That's not really the case in traditional sidechains. But I'm going to make an argument right now that why should we not have execution environments that are merge mine sidechains? I would say that you have more trust assumptions outside of your Bitcoin full node for DA, but I want to say that's kind of more of a moot point in this sense, because DA long-term, like we just mentioned, is not as scalable and sustainable. You can't bypass the L2 validator miners for exit. So even if you have a merge mine sidechain, you are relying on the sidechain kind of mechanism to be able to include your transaction in the sidechain block, and then go to the bridge to withdraw your funds. There is opportunity to extract MEV in really high fee revenue environments, and then we also have this question of can merge mining survive long-term only on fees. Sorry, we're not to the but yet, sorry. I thought I jumped ahead of myself. And also additionally, we need to remember that blockchains don't scale. No blockchain scales, and when we're talking about scaling, we're talking about more throughput. More throughput isn't scaling. Even if we have a roll-up with a centralized sequencer, we're not scaling anything. We're just taking a bunch of data and we're throwing it in another big box, and just increasing the throughput. And you get more throughput by bigger boxes, and more bigger boxes means less user validation of the network state. Blockchains don't scale. But we don't have to scale every blockchain. So when we're talking about merge mining, right, and merge mine DA, or even Bitcoin DA, we have this now weird thing where we have merge mined kind of side chains with transaction execution on chain directly. Is not always the most scalable system, but we could do something where we have merge mine DA. So what we can do is we can make a trade-off, kind of noted here, that we can make a trade-off by having a really secure bridge contract on the L1, and we can put DA onto another system that's more aligned with Bitcoin, whether that's a merge mine DA or a proof-of-stake DA type system. And we can basically create a trade-off mechanism for more higher value transactions. Let's say it's a really high value financial kind of system. We can maybe use Bitcoin DA for that. But if it's a more kind of everyday type of use case, we can use merge mine DA or a more Bitcoin aligned DA like Nubit, which is doing some proof-of-stake mechanism. For users who don't need that full level of security. So we can have a bit of a trade-off spectrum here. So why merge mine a DA layer? And I think this is where it gets really interesting. When you look at the trend of kind of what applications want, and I would say this is the very much case of all modular ecosystems, applications want to own their own ordering policy. They want to be able to have their own building policy for transactions. They want to be able to earn fees directly on the transactions that they're providing into a specific ecosystem, and they want to be able to make that revenue. Miners in that situation, if they're merge mining a DA layer, they have no influence directly on the transaction ordering of a specific chain, and they can't extract MEV and reorder transactions. You separate TX ordering from data availability, you can provide a better UX, so you can provide faster block times and transaction confirmation times. Note that these are pre-confirmations. They still have to be validated by the DA layer or the merge mine system in this example, but a lot of the times these pre-confirmations do end up going through. And teams, what I'm arguing also is that they don't have to launch a token to be sustainable. Because if you can just run your sequencer, you can make pretty good money. And we can just use big boxes. We can have one event trust assumption for data availability, and we can just have the sequencer and use really big boxes as centralized validators to these chains. But I will add that we need to have some mechanism for a user to be able to access the data and then also take that data and be able to propose a state transition directly to bridge contracts to make this actually work. So, and just to touch on the revenue, if you look at September, CBBTC just launched, and the base sequencer is making nearly $50,000 right now on CBBTC transactions alone. So if you actually have like a useful application that drives a lot of usage to your network, you can actually make a lot of money off sequencer fees, and you don't need to launch your own token to be sustainable. So I do want to go back to this though, on this like use big boxes trust assumption mechanism. So if you look at rootstock, for example, rootstock can make a more modular trade-off than the Bitcoin layer does. It can have potentially bigger blocks. It can implement something like blobs. And what we can do is we can have BitVMX as the bridge contract, which has that one event trust assumption that we love. So the user assumption now is if they can self-propose their own state transition, is if they get censored by a sequencer in this own application layer, they can bypass the sequencer, retrieve the data from a rootstock full node, and then post their state transition with that data to the bridge contract on Bitcoin to exit the system. There's a few different trust assumptions there, but when you look at modularly, as long as you can bypass the sequencer, it's a relatively strong trust assumption, and maybe only if you're having like $500,000, $600,000 transactions, or maybe less than that, maybe like 10,000, more high-value transactions, maybe you want to use Bitcoin for DA. Just to ensure that data is always available. But the more kind of normal the use case, maybe merge mine DA is a trade-off that we're willing to make. So that was a lot. Jumped over a few places. I want to give a TLDR to kind of explain how I'm thinking about this. Is that high-value transactions and high-value financial systems should always be used in a system where their guarantee is always dependent on a Bitcoin full node and the trust assumption related to the individual bridge contract. If that's BitVM2, BitVMX, et cetera, we have a one-event trust assumption and potentially permissionless challenging. So it would match that definition of an L2 that we gave earlier on any user being able to interact with a two-way peg. Most users will interact with systems that use off-chain DA. Because we talked about earlier that Bitcoin DA is not always scalable. But this is also the case for rollups. Rollups can also enable kind of like execution environments that support other chains, and so can sidechains. So when we think about sidechains and potentially rollups being kind of more layers where these rollup smart contracts live, we can build a system where we have merge mine DAs and merge mine the data availability layer to kind of create some incentive for miners to always have sustainable fee revenue. And if we have applications that own their own sequencing and are providing a lot of value and have more application-tailored specific VMs, we can build better applications than what we can build on general purpose environments. We can drive more users to these systems. And these applications own their own sequencing. They get to make money off running their own centralized sequencer, but we're still inheriting the security of the DA layer and the bridge contract respectively. So I think when we think about the application layer in the future, we want to be able to democratize teams to be able to have more authority over their ordering policy. I think decentralization for a lot of these application layers is kind of a meme in the sense. I don't think we always need to have a decentralized validator system for pre-confirmations, but we always need to retain the ability to have a very, very trust minimized DA layer and also a very native bridge contract on the L1 where anybody can challenge bridge operators that are trying to steal money from the system. So that's my argument. I think we should build towards rollups and then systems that support very application-specific chains where apps can have their own sequencing and apps can tailor their execution environments to specific use cases. So yeah, and all of that we need to do to ensure that we are incentivizing miners long-term because we want to use Bitcoin, the asset, on these chains, and that is our relationship with them as an L2. And we need to ensure that that this is sustainable, so we need to make sure that we're sustaining the security budget to make sure we retain a fixed supply of 21 million and ensure that, yeah, we can use Bitcoin on these systems long term. So that's my talk. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
And then they make the data available. And the main purpose of the token is if they attack to a rollup bridge by just withholding the data and publishing logs without just publishing the headers without publishing the logs, eventually social consensus can fall back and slash those tokens of these validators so that we can compensate for the bridge attack for the rollup. But for merge mine layers, there is nothing at stake. So if they attack to the rollup bridge and make the data unavailable, then at the end Does it not get staked in proof of work?
Yeah, so I think the argument against that is just like long term, or the economic models of the DA layer is going to be sustainable, and they're going to earn enough revenue in order to kind of incentivize people to hold the token, and and incentivize them to hold the token and kind of value the token and stake and secure the network. I think we're very early on systems like Avail and Celestia to see if those work long term. The argument I'm kind of making here is that we can have an alternative. I don't think using Celestia is like a terrible trust assumption. I actually, like, in the text, are like really, really cool. But here, if we can try to use like these DA layers and try to have more application-specific VMs, maybe we can, with better application layers, we can introduce more user transactions, more onboarding, and then that can sustainably like pay sequencer, sustain revenue where we're posting the sequencer batches on chain to these DA layers. I think you can also make trade-offs. Like, you don't have to blow up the block size. Like, you can have smaller blocks. Dependent on, and this is kind of like a trade-off space we need to explore more, but if you have smaller blocks, then it's more expensive to post your data there, but you get the advantage of having more full nodes available to be able to validate and store the data and make that available as well. So I think it's like a trade-off space, but I would agree that there is more of a incentive right now to run like a Celestia node than try to merge mine DA fees off a sidechain. But long term, I don't know if that's the case, and I don't think we've tried the economics of just trying to build really good application layers yet to see if we can create enough transaction volume to not have to use another token. Any other questions? Cool. Thanks, guys.